Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among his essays, Michel de Montaigne has one which is titled On Habit in English. In his French, it's de la costume, which has a certain resonance to it, which we'll explain in a moment, and it also has an additional title, or rather the title continues, on never easily changing a traditional law, and it's in effect two essays that are joined together dealing with some similar topics. So we're going to come back to the changing the laws in a separate discussion. So this term, costume, it's very similar to our word custom, right? But it also has the sense not just of things that we do, but it's got an ethical sense to it, things that we do because we ought to do. They're the things that people should do. And so it's got a similarity to the Latin mores, or to the Greek ethos or ethe, right? So he's talking about the kinds of habits that govern our judgments, our ideas, our actions, our values, our feelings about stuff. And he's going to give you a vast number of examples, very few of which we're going to look at here. You can read the essay and see him just, rattling them off. And the whole point of providing those examples is to show how varied human behavior, culture actually is, even though human nature is not radically different. And very early on in the essay, he's got this really great statement: habit is a violent and treacherous school teacher, maîtresse de l'école. So somebody who's teaching us violent, right? It's just a cognate from the French. And treacherous, traitesse, right? Betraying us, selling us out, you could say. Now that's a pretty strong characterization of habit. And Montaigne is pretty committed to this. He thinks that habits get us into a number of problems and troubles. And there's a number of different, we could call them subheadings that we can look at this with. And he says, gradually and stealthily, she slides her authoritative foot into us, then having by this gentle and humble beginning planted it firmly within us, later she discloses an angry, tyrannous countenance against which we're no longer allowed even to lift up our eyes. So habit begins bit by bit, and then it takes control over us. And he says, at every single turn, we find habit infringing the rules, the règles of nature, right? And he says, I trust here the cave in Plato's Republic. Now, what does that mean? Well, when you're in the cave, you cannot tell that your viewpoint is limited and you're taking the things of your culture, your situation, as being true. And we see that, a lot of things can be changed. He brings up, for example, a king who by means of habit brought his stomach to draw nourishment from poison, right? And a maiden who, as Albertus the Great relates, accustomed herself to live on spiders. And he says, these are examples from strange lands, but there's nothing strange about them, only if we consider what we learn by experience every day, how habit actually stuns our senses. So there's things that you get accustomed to that other people who aren't will react to, and you don't react to them anymore. He gives you some examples of noises. So, for example, blacksmiths, right, hitting with their hammers, millers who are grinding wheat or barley or whatever, and armorers could not put up with the noise impinging on their ears if they were stunned by it, as we are. And then he's got another really funny example here. My scented waistcoat, right? His clothing is an garment that they put some scent into. The only people who smell it after 3 days are other people. I don't smell it anymore because I've become accustomed to it. And he notes that this effect of habit on our senses can also go on if it's not something continuous. So he says, habit can combine and stabilize the effects of its impressions on our senses despite long gaps and intervals. What's the example that he gives here? Those who live near belfries. So, it was common to have big bells that you would ring at certain times. If there was some sort of crisis, you might ring the bell, but it might also be for, the hours, for the city watch, or for the church, or whatever it happens to be, right? And after a while, you just don't pay attention to it. Like those who live near trains, and the train goes by, and you're like, how can you possibly not be distracted by that? And they're like, you just get used to it. Or those who live near airports, another great example, right? And so he says, I actually, got used to living near a tower myself. Then he's got some really interesting reflections on childhood. So many of our habits are built in us when we are children. As a matter of fact, some of them can go on our entire life without ever being called into question. And he brings up the example of Plato criticizing a boy for playing dice, knuckle bones. And the boy says, you're chiding me for something unimportant. And Plato says, well, habit is not unimportant. And Montaigne says, I find our greatest vices acquire their bent during our most tender infancy. Mothers think their boys are playing when they see them wring the neck of a chicken or find their sport in wounding a dog or a cat. Some fathers are so stupid as to think it augurs well for a martial spirit if they see their son outrageously striking a peasant or a lackey who cannot defend himself, or for cleverness when they see him cheat a playmate by some cunning deceit or trick. And Montaigne is going to say it's really easy for us through habits to develop vices like cruelty, hurting animals, for example, or vulnerable people. Tyranny, wanting to have our own way, demanding that our viewpoint be the only one that matters. Or treachery, which means not just, actually being a traitor, but cheating other people, right? And he says that these are all ugly things. And so, we can say if a person would cheat over counters in a game, why wouldn't they cheat over money, right? Other people want to argue they're only counters, he wouldn't do that with money. And Montaigne is saying, you're building a habit there, right? So you're going to be that way. With tyranny, if you're always getting your own way as a kid, you're going to be a jerk adult who tries to do that with other people too. And so what should we do in childhood? He tells us we must carefully teach children to detest vices for what they consist in. Not just that people don't like them, we must teach them their natural ugliness so that they flee from them not only in their deeds, but even in their minds. The very thought of them should be hateful, whatever mask they hide behind. And he says, I was raised as a kid to be honest and open and to find it repugnant to introduce cunning and deceit into my childhood games. And so that has become my habit. Habit, as he's going to point out, also has massive influence on our psyche, even more than it does on our bodies. And he says that where our judgments and beliefs are concerned, what can habit not do? Right? Is there any opinion so bizarre that it can't be introduced by some sort of habit? And he says, well, no. And he's going to give you a whole bunch of examples like that. And he says that, I reckon there's no notion, however mad, which can occur to the imagination of men, of which we do not meet an example in some public practice or another, in which as a consequence is not propped up on its foundation by our discursive reasoning. And here he goes into a long discussion of different people's points of view, some of which may be true, some of which may be false or exaggerated, right? Now, another thing that he's going to point out is that, and there's several different places where he's talking about this, let's say we actually want to critically examine our beliefs and judgments and the habits that they seem to be based on. How does that work? You know, if we trace them back, will we find some original good reason for that habit and the beliefs and judgments that go along with that? And his answer is typically no. We're actually not going to find that. And so he brings up first an example about blowing your nose, right? So I think what he's actually describing here is what we in the Midwest call a farmer's blow, which is where you don't blow your nose into a handkerchief or a Kleenex. Instead, you tap one nostril and you blow out the other. Swimmers do this as well, right? And the mucus goes straight out onto the ground. And it's considered kind of gross, uncouth. And he says, you know, I knew a guy, a nobleman, who used to do that. And this is something quite opposed to our customs. When I asked him about it, it made our customs look a little silly. He said, why should that filthy mucus be so privileged that we should prepare fine linen to receive it, and then going even further, wrap it up and carry it carefully about on our persons? That practice ought to excite more loathing and nausea than seeing him simply excrete it as we do our other droppings. So, you know, the habit is itself unreasonable if we're looking at it carefully. And, you know, he goes on and he says, you know, when we do actually try to trace out where these habits are coming from, we don't get something that actually does make sense. So he says, I once had the duty of justifying one of our practices, which far and wide around us is accepted as having established authority. I did not wish to maintain it, as is usually done, exclusively by force of law and examples, so I traced it back to its origins. I found its basis to be so weak that I all but loathed it, I who is supposed to encourage it in others. We don't find reason behind many of our habits. They have unreasonable grounds, which is not great for us, right? He also is going to tell us that the principal activity of custom is so to seize us, to grip us, right? And to keep us in its claws that it's hardly in our power to struggle free. And then what would we do when we struggle free? To come back into ourselves where we can reason and argue about her ordinances. Habit is so strong that it's difficult for us to pull ourselves away from it, go into ourselves, and actually critically, rationally scrutinize it, and then cast some sort of judgment upon it. And he says, you know, the counsels of truth and her precepts are taken to apply to the generality of men, never to ourselves. We store them up in our memory, not in our manners, which is most stupid and unprofitable, right? And then he says, let's get back to custom's imperial sway. And he gives some examples about politics and arrangements of that sort of thing. Now, he also talks about a very interesting example. He points out, though, that why is it so difficult for us to be reasonable about habits? Well, because the universal precepts of reason are difficult to investigate thoroughly. And then he's got this fascinating example about his own nation, France. And he says, what is more uncouth than a nation where by legal custom, the office of judge is openly venal, meaning they take advantage of it, and where verdicts are simply bought for cash, where quite legally justice is denied to anyone who cannot pay for it, and where this trade is held in such high esteem. Now notice the phrase he's going to use here. There is formed a fourth estate in the Commonwealth. We often talk about the press, which is an institution that arises, you could say, in the 17th and 18th centuries. We talk about that as being the fourth estate. Montaigne actually talks about the judiciary and judges as being the fourth estate. And what is he referring to? Well, the three estates that were recognized before are the church, the nobility, and the people. Each of these has a legitimate stake in governance, right? In saying how the nation ought to be set up, who should be in charge. Judges are becoming this fourth estate and undermining things. He says, where this fourth estate, having charge of the laws and sovereign authority over lives and chattels, should be quite distinct from the nobility, with the result that there's two sets of laws, the law of honor and the law of justice, which are strongly opposed in many matters. The first condemns an unavenged accusation of lying. The other condemns the revenge, right? And we can think about this in our own time. Do we have anything like this where people are like, well, that's just the way we do things here, and you're like, this is unreasonable, but this is the way that we've been going on with that. That has become the custom. I think we can think of lots of things like that. He also has an interesting reflection here when he's talking about clothing. He tells us that, listen, a lot of clothing and fashion is just based on habit. And he's got a great example here. He says that our doctoral bonnets, that long tail of pleated velvet hanging down from the heads of our women folk with its motley fringes, and that silly codpiece, that's a piece that you wear over your junk as a male, uselessly modeling a member which we cannot even decently call by its name. These are ridiculous fashions. On the other hand, he says, a person of intelligence will follow the common fashion. Now, why the hell would he do that? He says that it seems to me that all idiosyncratic and outlandish modes derive less from reason than madness and ambitious affectation. It's in his soul that a wise man should withdraw from the crowd, maintaining its power and freedom freely to make judgments, while externally accepting all received forms and fashions. So you don't want to be a contrarian just for the sake of doing that, to go against the habit, but you can relativize the fashions of the time. And I'm going to close by bringing up two phrases that he uses to describe habit. He tells us that Pindar rightly calls habit the queen and empress of the world. So what a strong endorsement. But it's not a positive endorsement. It's saying, yeah, habit runs things. And then finally, towards the end of this section, he says that the rule of rules, the general law of laws, is that each should observe those of the place wherein he lives. So we can talk about a meta habit or rule, right? And this is actually something that we typically do, but it's also something that's enforced through social conformity and having customs in place, we might say. So that's a very important set of reflections by Montaigne on the force that habit or custom plays in all of our existences, whether we realize it or not.